then we'll have the local representatives talking from the local campaign, and then we will open it up to the floor. So, without further ado, would you please welcome Professor Alan Evans to speak first.
Great.
It's on. Yeah.
Hello? Right. It gives me great pleasure to be here, of course.
1, 2, 1, 1.
Hand it to a professional.
Just right up to your right.
Up close, okay. So thank you for the invitation. Sorry to be a bit late. I was taking part in an oral hearing in Magherafelt. At least I thought it was going to be in Omagh, which would have been on the way here, but instead they switched it this morning to Magherafelt. And I had to leave before I could unburden myself of most of my message, so don't worry, you're not going to get it now. So, the actual oral hearing I was at was for a very large wind farm, the largest so far in the north of Ireland, in a place called Dorval in the Sperrins, which is pristine blanket bog and thick blanket up to, it should be raised bog because it's 3 and 4 meters thick in places. And really the last place you should put wind turbines because you never pay back the amount of carbon, you never save the amount of carbon you release. There it is. So, again, 2 years ago I wrote a fairly lengthy article. It was in the Journal of Social Science, a special issue on human rights and social justice. And I wrote this one, and I managed to get 3 others to write articles on the same theme about the problem of noise pollution in a rural setting, particularly to do with wind farms. And the question I asked was, has public health become too utilitarian? And public health has a background in utilitarianism from the English philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who died in 1832. And utilitarianism pledges the maximum happiness for the greatest number, and therefore accepts that sometimes, because of a common good, some people have to suffer a bit. So there's a little bit of collateral damage, and that was the case in vaccination in the 19th century, and currently is the case with MMR, measles, in this century. A few people will get reactions, but it's far better to have a high herd immunity and keep things right. So, and what I was saying basically was public health had become too utilitarian because it was prepared to accept too much collateral damage for those exposed to wind farm noise. And I wrote it because I was annoyed with my colleagues. I am public health, but I'm academic public health and epidemiology, which is a study of determined disease. Okay, we have a thing in our part of the island which is called ETSU R97, formulated in 1996, was to be reviewed in 2 years' time, relates to turbines of a hub height of 32 millimeters, it's about 32 meters, pretty small ones by today's standards. It was formulated by 14 guys, all of them guys. Half of them were wind farm people, the other half were civil servants and the like. And what they said was wind was great. They said very little about infrasound and low frequency noise. They recommended the use of A weighting, which I'll come to. As I said, relevant to pretty small turbines, tiny in comparison with the turbines that are planned for here, which I believe are about 550 feet, and 10 of them. And what we now know is that the larger the wind turbine, the more noise they emit. They emit noise in the audible range, but also in the inaudible range and the low frequency range. Below 20 is generally considered to be inaudible. Infrasound is everywhere. The problem with wind turbine noise, it is pulsed, and it is usually of high intensity. Now, what happened then was the report in 2001, Casella Stanger, and what it looked at was the fact that there were problems with low frequency noise. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but they pointed out that people inside buildings with windows closed, the effect is exacerbated by the sound insulation properties of the building envelope. Mid and high frequencies are attenuated to a greater extent than the low frequency. So you may think that you're better off in a well-insulated building. In fact, you're worse off. And they also recommended that the A weighting, as opposed to the linear distribution of measurement of sound, and this was introduced because of telephone engineering in the 1920s, and we're saddled with it a century later. We knew from 1973 that fans turning inside buildings made people sick building syndrome. And in fact, the Russians in 1973 introduced legislation for safe levels of infrasound in various environments. And there are the levels. I'm going to skip over these. But it is now 35 years since studies which began in 1979 and looked at a particular single turbine in Boone, North Carolina, which sat atop Harold's Knob, as it's charmingly put. It's 237 feet high, and there was a problem. They found that 12% of families within 3 kilometers, roughly 2 miles, were impacted by noise emissions from this single wind turbine, which was 72 meters in height. It was also aggravated by what's called complex terrain, particularly water is a problem, and where you've got curves, natural amphitheaters, it tends to be magnified. The report ran to 232 pages. It was commissioned by the United States Energy Department. And so, as I said again, the noises and the sounds, the uneasiness and the personal disturbance were worse and more annoying inside the affected homes. Things rattled in the house, noise was found to be more persistent and more severe at night, and it was low pulsatile emitted frequency acoustic radiation, and this was the factor which was disturbing people. So what happened then? Blair came along, produced his low carbon energy future document in February 2003. That report I quoted from was 2001 and said there was a problem, but that wasn't good enough for Blair because he produced, with the help of his chief scientist, Sir David King, who also recommended that local issues could not determine the national need. That is the utilitarian principle being applied, but again, if the size of the people impacted is quite large, the collateral damage is too large. And what he did, he ignored the Casella Stanger report, and he produced his own report, which was commissioned from a man called Jeff Leventhal, who famously says, "What you can't hear won't harm you." It's a lot more, I'm going to push through these, but basically you probably noticed that 2003 was a good year for reports and dossiers, because that's the same year, in fact a month afterwards, that Blair had justified the invasion of Iraq with a dossier which was decidedly dodgy. But we're saddled with that. There's some other wonderful, the handling of the foot and mouth epidemic of 2001 to 2002. This is all Sir David King's work, the promotion of diesel engines and the introduction of badger cull, which is not such a great success. Okay, so along come the Irish Wind Energy Development Guidelines, the ETSU guidelines, which were reinforced by Leventhal in 2003, were to be reviewed every 2 years. In 2006, the Irish government came along and they employed an English firm, the Mackenzie Hay Partnership, and what they did is they took the English recommendations, and they watered them down. And they have promised ever since to review them, but we are still waiting. My father was a geographer, and he said to me probably 50 years ago that England and Ireland are like an old couple who, having undergone a prolonged, unhappy, forced marriage, favouring the stronger partner, then underwent a bitter and bloody divorce, and afterwards continued to live in sin together. And the Irish Wind Energy Development Guidelines don't even mention infrasound. It's nowhere in the document. Doesn't exist. And in general, noise is unlikely to be a significant problem where the distance from the nearest turbine to any noise-sensitive property is more than 500 metres, which is sadly untrue. We heard, as I said, from Boone, North Carolina, it went out to at least 2 miles, and in fact it goes out a lot further. And it's also, the Irish Wind Energy Guidelines say, a distance is greater than 10 rotor diameters from the turbine, the potential for shadow flicker is very low. Again, that is manifestly untrue, and it doesn't go out 10 rotor diameters, it goes out something more like 10 miles. And again, planning authorities should encourage developers to engage in public consultation with the local community. While it is not a mandatory requirement, it is strongly recommended, and so on, and of course, that really has not happened at all. The Finnish Environmental Health Association, which is, like yourselves, not an official organisation of government, but people trying to defend themselves, have a very good acoustician, and they have found that the effects of these things go out something like 15 kilometres. And the dangers of sound we cannot hear. This is 1967. The lower a sound is pitched, the farther it carries. A police whistle, 2,900 cycles per second, can be heard 500 metres away. A giant whistle with a frequency of 29 cycles per second, which is 5 cycles per second lower than the lowest note on a piano, has a range of 50 kilometres. So you can see there is a problem. And even weak intensity infrasound can penetrate houses, and it can bend round corners, can travel well over water and through it. And the Swedish study conducted on healthy volunteers, published in 2016, has shown that the noise produced by wind turbines, particularly low frequency band amplitude modulation, I'll come to amplitude modulation, it's disruptive to sleep, indicated by increasing electrophysiological awakenings, lighter sleep with more wakefulness, and reduced deep sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. You've heard of REM, that's where it comes from. So it used to be thought that sleep was some sort of evolutionary hangover which had no function. It's now realised to be of vital importance. It's of vital importance for the laying down of memory. It is of vital importance for the brain and other parts of the body in expunging waste products. It has a number of very important functions and contributes, of course, to mental well-being. And when you deprive people of sleep in a laboratory, you very, very quickly get important changes in body chemistry. There was one study which deprived healthy volunteers of sleep for a few days, and something like 700 genes were altered in their expression, measured by what is called the transcriptome, messenger ribonucleic acid. So it is a very, very profound and important effect. And sleep is arranged in cycles of round about 90 minutes. And when you, at the end of the cycle, you have what is called an arousal, which is less exciting than you would think. It just means that you sort of wake up a bit, but you go back to sleep with the presence of low frequency, impulsive, incessant, and intrusive low frequency noise produced by any particular machines, turbines, and so on. You don't tend to go back to sleep. You wake up, so your sleep cycles are disrupted. And once you have disrupted sleep, you're in real problems. And the presence of what's amplitude modulation, this is where you get interference between turbines. Remember the Boom MOD1 turbine was one single turbine. You've got 10 turbines. At Doraville they're going to have about 50. And particularly when they're placed close together, which Borden and Mona and Culture are not very good at this, and they tend to put the turbines too close together. They interfere, they produce more what is known as amplitude modulation. It increases and effectively doubles the noise output across the range of sound. So that is a problem. And it is associated with increased annoyance. Annoyance is not good for you, and it is, again, disruptive of sleep. And the prevalence and they were measuring inside houses, and that is very important. What they'd found in at Boone in North Carolina, Kelly's original study, that it was worse in small rooms. It was worse inside the rooms, and these are the very rooms where we tend to put our children. So we are deleteriously affecting our children. And then there is recent evidence that, well, I'll come back to this, but it's the way we perceive infrasound. Is it through the ear or is it by another route? And there's now mounting evidence that we're imbibing it through the surface of our bodies rather than going in through our ears. So the old saying about what you can't hear won't harm you, it's rubbish. Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay. 20 minutes up?
5 minutes.
Okay, fine, I better hurry up then. Just to show that the audible indoor low frequency tone was modulated to the Bladecraft frequency for 20% of the time out to 1.5 miles, and it occurred for a similar percentage of time between wind farms' percentage power capacities of 40 and 85%, and it for about 16% of the time was out to 2.2 miles. And I'm going to speed up here because I've got too much material. Basically, so again, what you can't hear won't harm you. There are now studies which rely on functional nuclear magnetic resonance imaging of the brain. You can image it and measure levels of electrical current by EEGs, but you can also measure blood flows. And so you can see which parts of the brain are being affected. So at about 20 hertz, it seems that there's a switch over and you're taking the infrasound in through your skin. And if that is the case, because small children lose heat faster than adults, it's because their surface area to their size is much greater. It means they will be taking in a bigger dose. They are likely to be taking in a bigger dose of infrasound. And I've seen very badly impacted children. Again, German studies have now shown that everyone can perceive it, right down to 8 hertz. So we're getting it, but only some of us are reacting to it. And that, again, is important. Just to speed up here, I've got far too much material. Right, we're reacting to it. I'll come back to that. Very important study published last year, which a German cardiac surgeon had a friend who went to live, he's an artist who went to live in the country, and a wind farm opened up, and this friend became very ill. And what Professor Val did was get pieces of human heart muscle and attach them up to a measurement device and played infrasound to them. And what he showed was that human heart muscle is directly affected by infrasound and reduces its contractile capacity by about a third, by a quarter to a third. So there are very profound physiological things going on. And just go on with this. So the extracochlear model is not great, and in 2009 Nina Pierpoint noted that infrasonic waves emanating from wind turbines cause a sensation of internal quivering, vibration, pulsation, accompanied by agitation, anxiety, alarm, irritability, rapid heartbeat, nausea, and sleep disturbance. So it is a multifarious effect, and it's an important effect, and that became known as wind farm syndrome. And wind companies don't like that to be known, and they tend to rubbish it. So the way I look upon it, in the Industrial Revolution, this applies more to England and here in Scotland. But what happened, the clearance of the land and the rural poor were taken to factories, into cities, where they were exposed to all sorts of noxious agents. They were enslaved, they were very poorly paid, they suffered a lot of injury, and they were the victims of the first industrial revolution. To suggest that the second industrial revolution is where you move very large pieces of machinery to the country, and instead of moving the people, you're moving the equipment to the country to produce effects in the rural population. So that's what you've got to look at. So I'll stop it there. Thank you.
Alan Evans, Professor Emeritus and Epidemiology at the School of Public Health at the University of Belfast. Thanks very much for that. We're not going to open up the floor yet, just 2 questions. We're going to hear from all our speakers and the local groups, and then, so if you want to, maybe in particular, there's a lot of detail in that and a lot of information, so if you want to just kind of bear that in mind, if you have a pen, or you want to come back to Alan and you can ask him questions then. Okay, next up is Jack O'Sullivan, and Jack's going to speak to us on the environmental implications of wind turbines. This is Jack O'Sullivan.
First of all, thank you very much for such a kind invitation. Is this switched on? Can everyone hear it? Good. I love coming to County Leitrim. To me it's a very, very special county, having first heard about it really in 1972, when I was working in the University of Lancaster, and a group of people from that university came over to Leitrim and set up what was then the North Leitrim Vegetable Growers Association. And there was a great newsletter published for many, many years, and I stayed with them for a while, and I learned in school, erroneously as it so happened, that Leitrim soil was useless. That was complete rubbish. Because when I saw the vegetables that were growing there, and I know this is a little bit off beam when we were supposed to talk about wind farming, but just shows you how misinformation can be very damaging. And this is where it's great to have someone like Alan Evans, who gives good information that is not part of not representing some particular industry sector. But the soil there at Eden near Rossinver, when that small group of young people had fertilized it, and not with artificial fertilizer, no way, they were totally organic, mixed it with every kind of organic material they could find, even they said hedge clippings from the convent, and they produced the most beautiful vegetables. But to show the way that the soil was, if you dug down about well more the depth of a spade, you came upon this daub. And I remember taking some of it away, and I was working in a pottery in County Mayo at the time, and you could make pots out of it. We could also grow lovely vegetables. So what was wrong with Leitrim soil? Nothing. Except if you were an industrial scale farmer and you wanted heavy machinery, then it wasn't obviously a good place to be. But it's ideal for the small scale farmer and food producer. Turning now to wind farming. Well, wind seems such a nice, clean source of energy. It has this feeling of, fresh air blowing, coming in off the Atlantic. It doesn't cost anything. Well, so they say. It does cost. And this is the problem. There's a number of serious problems about wind energy. Professor Alan Evans has mentioned public health. I want to mention another one, which is also important from a public point of view. The energy of wind is a communal resource. It's not owned by anyone. Think about the electromagnetic spectrum. Think about the radio waves that power our mobile phones. That is a communal resource. But what did our dear government do? They sold it to private individuals who made not millions, but billions out of it. Now that was manifestly unfair. And what's also manifestly unfair from a social perspective about these large-scale industrial wind farms is, here's a common resource, and it's been individual wealthy companies, and I'd include Queecha, which behaves like a wealthy company, does not behave like a service organisation. And these companies are using that communal resource to enrich themselves and impoverish other people. And the problem with large-scale wind turbines is a few get wealthy and the vast majority suffer either through health, through loss of the beauty of a landscape, or loss of a species which they hold dear, like the hen harrier, the otter, and so on. So that is one problem. How do you get around these problems? Can they be got around? I think they can. And one way of doing it is not to have large industrial scale wind turbines, but to permit and encourage people, if they so want, and if their neighbours agree, that's very important, small scale wind turbines on individual houses. Why not that? And give everyone what's called a feed-in tariff. In other words, if you're not using all the electricity that you are generating, sell it to your neighbour. There is now a European directive which requires that to happen. And I'll tell you why it's not happening in Ireland in a second or two. So why are we not following the path of Denmark, where 50% of all the electricity generated is generated by micro-producers, that's to say solar, wind, or biomass energy, produced by villages, ordinary people, farmers, cooperatives, and so on. Or Germany, where 2.1 million micro-producers are producing more than any single power station. So that is a good route to go if you want to harvest the energy of wind without causing serious problems, is allowing individual households with the agreement of their neighbours to produce electricity. A farmer living on a hill can produce electricity. Somebody on a high part of the landscape can produce electricity, and under European regulations can sell it to her neighbour. So where does that leave EirGrid and ESB networks? And here I think we do have a serious problem with wind energy in Ireland. Unfortunately, our EirGrid and ESB networks, they used to, a long time back, see themselves as a service organisation. Way back in the 1940s, when it was the Electricity Supply Board, they sent out men who put poles everywhere in the countryside, rural electrification. They weren't thinking too much about making profits. They were thinking about serving people by giving electricity. Now you had to pay for it, but at least it was there for yours. And it created a major social revolution. Farmers had milking machines, people could cook electrically, electric light came to Ireland into the farthest part of the rural environment, and that was quite a good thing. Somewhere along the way, in the mid-90s, ESB became an organisation that was told to make profits. And they are looking at other wind energy producers as competitors. But they're willing to accept, and it's being pushed by government, they're willing to accept large-scale commercial wind farms. So why are we not having small-scale producers of electricity in Ireland? And in addition to wind, why not have more solar? Years and years ago, in the 1970s, I worked for the National Science Council as a science policy analyst based in Dublin. At that time, in 1974, there was a huge rise in oil prices. Some of us older people might remember that, and how there was not enough oil. Oil prices had gone way up. And what happened? A number of European countries, including Denmark, including Ireland, including Germany, embarked on research to look at other sources of energy that would keep the country going, because energy is essential. And one of the sources of energy examined at the time was wind, another was solar. And the man who was doing the solar, Eamon Lawler, I remember his name, produced this marvellous report which said Ireland has more solar energy per head of population than France. Wow. Now, when the oil prices stabilized, Denmark continued with their research program. Now Denmark is the largest producer of wind turbines in Europe. And their policy is let the big companies develop their wind huge wind turbines offshore. Onshore, no. Smaller turbines which are acceptable to local populations. So we have gone the other way of not giving local people the power or the financial support for their own energy, but allowing big companies to dominate the scene. And if you look at, say, Germany, now, Eamon Lawler's report said that Ireland had good solar energy. I did some research myself in 2015 in response to a government invitation to make some submissions on energy, and I looked at solar. And I spent about a month doing some research. And what did I find? Solar is becoming cheaper than wind. And wind turbines can become more efficient as time goes on, but there's not an awful lot of scope for increasing the efficiency of a turbine. But there was a lot of scope, and there still is, for increasing the efficiency of solar, using new materials, mass production of solar panels, and so on. So why are we not developing more solar energy? Given that Ireland has, and I remember the figures, 85% of the amount of solar energy per square metre as Germany. And look what Germany has done, with millions of solar panels on roofs everywhere. So solar is a good way of going ahead, small-scale wind is a good way of going ahead. Large-scale wind has got a lot of problems. Professor Alan Evans mentioned public health. I would also mention effects on wildlife, where there is a serious problem with bird mortality. And when you go to an area like the current one planned, you have also the problems of a lovely, pristine area, blanket bog, thick blanket bog, almost a raised bog, one of the most pristine and vulnerable and important habitats, which Ireland holds in trust for Europe, can be damaged and will be damaged, because you cannot simply drive roads through it, create wind turbine bases with hundreds of tons of concrete and hundreds of tons of steel without causing serious environmental damage and destroying the habitat. So there's a lot of problems. Another problem I might mention is wind is intermittent. It's not there when you want it sometimes, also other times there's too much of it. So what do we have to do if we rely too much on wind? We find that we have to have other sources of power running almost simultaneously. So you can't do without certain other sources like gas-fired power stations. The wind drops, you must be able to keep that power going. Now what happens if you have a mixture of wind and solar? A little bit better. If you have small-scale wind and solar, there's always wind somewhere. We have a problem in Ireland because unlike, say, Germany, which is very lucky, just across the water from Germany is Norway. And when the wind doesn't blow very much in Denmark and the sun isn't shining in Germany, they can import very cheap electricity from Norway where it's generated by hydropower. We might have that possibility if we put that underground cable across to France. But France also generates electricity by nuclear. Now they haven't had an accident so far, touch wood, but still a lot of people are unhappy about nuclear electricity. So there are a number of serious problems now with wind energy. I've been involved, as your chairman said, in opposing a number of wind farms. And two of them are of particular interest to you. One is very close to where we live in Cool, County Westmeath. And this shows you the kind of thing that goes on, which always makes me distrust wind farm developers. We have in County Westmeath thousands of hectares of bog, which has been exploited for many years by a number of companies that are closely linked to each other. Tyrone peat, Westmeath peat, Bulrush horticulture. They're all linked to each other, and they're mostly based in County Tyrone. They are operating without an EPA license. They're operating without planning permission. They are illegal. So what do? Two of those companies have now linked in with another company called Cool Wind Farm. But Cool Wind Farm is a wholly owned subsidiary of Element Power Limited. And you will have heard of Element Power. Nice crowd. They said about 4 or 5 years ago, we're going to erect 1,700 wind turbines in the largely uninhabited parts of the Midlands of Ireland. That caused grave and serious repercussions. Everybody in the Midlands, including myself, said, it's them taking our resources again. And they were going to transmit this energy across to Britain, because Britain could not provide enough locations for wind farms to meet the renewable energy requirements. So, Element Power, not such a nice crowd. Wholly owned subsidiary of them, Cool Wind Farm, not such a nice crowd. Teamed up with Bulrush Horticulture and Tyrone Peat, operating illegally. Now, here's a curious thing about that wind farm. We were battling it, and the before us, who were also involved in the situation, was Westmeath County Council. And Westmeath County Council brought in a change, a material change in the county development plan, which said that there will be a new policy on wind, that no wind turbine should be closer to an inhabited house than 10 times the height of the turbine. Great. It's clear. If you want to build a very big turbine, keep far away from houses, though not far enough. But still, what did the minister at the time do? Shot it down under an order made by the minister to say, get rid of that policy, or we'll force you to get rid of it. Westmeath County councillors passed the same resolution a second time. Another minister for the same area shot it down again and said to Westmeath County Council, remove that policy or we'll force you. Westmeath County Council passed the same resolution, or a very similar one, a third time. And the minister was silent. And I thought, why is this? Why is the minister not sending a really sharp letter to the County Council in Westmeath? Well, it turned out that in Donegal, the County Council in Donegal had passed a similar motion, changing the wind farm policy. And the minister had sent to the Donegal County Council a similar letter saying, get rid of it or we'll order you to do that. But one of the councillors, I think he might have been chairman of the County Council in Donegal, took a High Court action against the minister and won it. And the minister's order was quashed. So the minister could do nothing about the policy now set in stone in Westmeath. And that was good. But when Cool Wind Farm Limited wanted to make a planning application for their wind farm, they completely ignored that policy as if it didn't exist. They'd obviously hoped it would go away. So what happened was very interesting. Westmeath County Council, as a planners, had to refuse permission because they can't go against their own development plan. Now the county manager was pretty furious, but the councillors and the planners said, we cannot grant permission because this is against the county development plan. So what did Cool Wind Farm do with the backing, of course, of Element Power Limited? They appealed to An Bord Pleanála, and we also put in an appeal saying this wind farm is completely wrong, it shouldn't be allowed, it's illegal, it's done by, the promoters are people who have flouted the law, it's on land on which is an illegal activity. An Bord Pleanála granted permission. Yeah. Horror. But what we've done, we've not stopped yet, and we've now taken a judicial review proceedings against the decision of the board. We've passed the first hurdle, which is to get leave or permission of the court to go to the next stage, which is the full hearing. So there might be a victory yet, we just don't know. And the other one, I think a few people here may remember this with the oral hearing in Longford recently, when a group called, again it was Bord na Móna, were proposing a wind farm in a place called Derryad. And the Note Derryad Wind Farm Group, I worked with them quite a bit, and we put in a major submission to An Bord Pleanála, which is yet to be decided. But there we had another series of arguments too as well. That particular bogland area, where that wind farm would be located, if permitted, was very low-lying, very flat, liable to flooding, and could very, very easily be re-wetted. And if you read the report of the Citizens' Assembly on climate change and the report of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on climate change, it says re-wet the boglands where that's possible. Maybe not, you can't do that too much with upland boglands, but you can certainly do it with the low-lying boglands. And by re-wetting them, they will again become absorbers of carbon dioxide, and they will build up that carbon in the bog. So they are, from a climate change point of view, essential to have bogs functioning well. What Bord na Móna has left in the Midlands of Ireland, everywhere, are partly cut over bogs where the active living sphagnum peat moss is gone. So the bogs are actually emitting carbon dioxide, emitting greenhouse gases to the air, and they're as bad as any factory emitting CO2. So our argument, which we don't know how Bord Pleanála will go on this, will take it or not, is that bog where that wind farm has made an application should be re-wetted. And that gives another advantage too as well, because you can now create nature reserves. You can have a centre to describe all of this. You can have people working on them, because people who are working on those bogs, harvesting turf, harvesting milled peat, they will be out of a job. So you create jobs by creating nature reserves and interpretive centres. So maybe there are other arguments here for this slightly different kind of environment, which shows you the different kind of arguments can be used. Every wind farm application is in a particular location. The arguments are different. The grounds for opposing it are different each time. So I think we will find also that there are very, very good grounds for arguing when people make their planning application, for arguing against it. The problem is we have to also make sure those arguments stick within Bord Pleanála, and they must be based on European and on national policy and on climate policy. Thank you very much.